Hey, this is Carl Reese here, bringing you Bible prophecy while we watch and pray. I'm going to be going into sort of continuing my talk from yesterday, where we were discussing about the nation of Israel and how it feeds into our understanding of these last days and how we know that we're living in the times of the end. I just sort of by way of recap from yesterday, I had talked about how God sort of is operating in two different threads of understanding in the earth today. One is the ancient promise that he made to Abraham way back at the very earliest time, 1700 years before Jesus came, where he promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations and that he would give him the land of Israel that stretches from the Red Sea in the south of Egypt all the way north to the Euphrates River and east into Jordan. And he would give all of that land to his descendants after him, and how he would fulfill that promise in the end. And this says, out of his seed, he would become the father of many nations. Notice it said seed, singular. And that's both imagery of his natural seed that proceeded forth out of him through the promise of Isaac and then the promise of Jacob. And then the 12 tribes of the 12 children of Jacob that were born, which became the nation of Israel, but also through his spiritual seed, which was the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And that's the one through whom all of us, the rest of us, received that same promise that he gave to Abraham. And then the second thread is the thread where God is working through the church. He's working through the people who have received Jesus as their Messiah. That's both the Jews that have received him as their Messiah and the Gentiles who have received him as their Savior, as the one promised by God, as the one who would bring grace into our lives and would add to us the salvation that God intended for all of his creation. But before I dive in any deeper, I would like to actually go over my Bible prophecy ground rules, and then we'll just dig in here. So my Bible prophecy ground rules: we will let the Bible interpret itself. The interpretation must remain consistent throughout all the scriptures. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, we will let every single word be established wherever possible. If it's not interpreted, if there's prophetic vision or dreams or images that are there, we'll let the Bible. If it's not interpreted, we're going to take it literally and not try to add an interpretation that's not there. And finally, I'm going to be okay with, I just don't know when that's actually the case. So let me just sort of dive in here, because Israel is just so central to our understanding of Bible prophecy. It's so central to our understanding of the times in which we're living. Because God had both of these trains that he's working in parallel right now, he will absolutely fulfill all the promises he made to Abraham and fulfill them through his seed, the promise that he gave to the Jews, to Israel. And at the same time, he made many promises in the Old Testament that of the seed that fulfilled the spiritual side of that promise, which was Jesus. And those who have accepted Jesus in the earth today is the other thread that God speaks of, and that John, in much of the book of Revelation, talked a lot about the Gentile nations and the people who would be living at the time of the end, and gave specific prophecies for everyone, Jew and Gentile, to take heed of. And that both of these trains or these threads would be coming together at the very end of time, culminating in the second coming of Jesus Christ to the earth. So I'm really focused in right now on the Jewish side of those prophecies. We've been talking a lot about Revelation and about the Gentile side and about the times of the church and the rapture of the church and how it fits into the second coming of Jesus. And those things have to happen, and they will happen. But he also has this other side that we just don't typically, as Christians, we don't really focus in too much on. I mean, we think that God has just left the Jewish people, that he's abandoned them, and that in everything having to do with the Jews, God has nothing to do with them anymore, because after all, they were the ones who put him on the cross, and they decided that he should be crucified. And since they rejected their Messiah, now God is not for them anymore, but he's only for the Gentiles and the Christians. And we've come up with this replacement theology as if God was like us. Because we do that thing, right? We will make a promise and we'll break it. We'll break it. It happens all the time. It happens in marriage, it happens in friendships, it happens, we just, our word isn't so good. I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. We're not so hot at doing what we say all the time. But God isn't like us, right? When he said, Abraham, I'm going to make a promise to you, and I'm sealing it with blood. And when we walk between the blood of those animals that you split in half, that is like life. It cannot be broken, right? So if he made these promises, and again, it's reiterated in the New Testament, if he made these promises to Abraham, God will absolutely fulfill it to the letter. And so if we're going to look at end-time Bible prophecy, we need to look at the promises and the ways that he's dealing with the nation of Israel from, as much as we can, from an Israeli perspective. Not try to overlay on top of the Jews how Gentiles think, or act like we can know the details and the ins and outs of the word and the revelation that was given to Jews for us. But if we learn about their symbols and about the processes and the festivals and the way of thinking that God relayed to the Jewish people, and we learn from that, and really to adopt that even as wisdom for ourselves wherever we can and as much as possible, we actually get closer to understanding the mindset of God. We get closer to understanding and really being able to interpret the prophecies fully, because they will often have two angles. They will often have a very heavily Jewish tilt to them, if not directly speaking directly to Jews, right? And not speaking to the Gentiles at all. And they also many times will have a second meaning that has to do with how he's working with the church and how the church will be reacting and how the church that believes in Jesus will be responding to the same events, right? And so I'm trying to look at this thing from both sides of that coin so we can get a more accurate and complete picture as we're looking at these things. So remember we talked yesterday about how God made the covenant with the Jews and said, in Deuteronomy 28, if you'll follow my word exactly as I've specified it and keep all my commandments, then all these blessings will take you and overtake you. You'll be blessed going in, you'll be blessed going out. Blessed will be the fruit of your womb, blessed will you be in the field, blessed will you be in the work, blessed will you be everywhere. But then he said, if you don't, then these curses will overtake you and you'll be scattered and your enemies will chase you. And I'm going to run you out of the very land that I gave you. Right? And sickness and disease will come all over you. And your prosperity will just be fleeting. You'll work really hard for somebody else to enjoy it. And so on and so on. Right? And so God is still dealing with the Jews because the Jews are dealing with God on that covenant. God is dealing with the Jews in that covenant. Right? And he made a covenant with Abraham that he will keep. Now, the interesting thing about that, because we saw this happen more than once, right? First with David and then with Solomon, and the Jews actually were fulfilling all that God said to them because they were following the commands of God, and God was blessing them, right? But once they stopped doing that, right toward the end of Solomon's reign, then God started letting the consequence of their idolatry overtake them, and ultimately the kingdom first was split after Solomon passed away, and it became the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom sort of took on the name Israel, even though it was only 10 of the 12 tribes that were involved in that Israel. And then the southern kingdom, which was really just Judah and Benjamin, right? Only those two tribes. And they sort of took and had the land that encompassed Jerusalem and Judea and the West Bank of today, and the regions surrounding down to Egypt, right? And it became divided instantly from their disobedience, right? And then later, first one and then the other were just conquered by the Babylonians and then scattered and dispersed from their land, right? So the consequence of the word came. But then they did what we read yesterday. Solomon said, if they turn, if my people sin, and then you have to disperse them like that. If they repent and turn from their evil ways and look back toward Jerusalem and say, God, forgive us for our sin, then God, please be merciful to them and return them into the land and begin to fulfill the promise that you gave to Abraham. Because of their disobedience, don't let your promise be made null and void. Right? So he was looking out for God and praying for the integrity of God to override the unfaithfulness of the people that he intended to bless. And God, being as merciful as he is, did exactly that. As they turned, he sent them first to rebuild their temple in the place where it is now Jerusalem. And then he sent Nehemiah in to build the walls around the temple. And gradually, and then Herod came and he basically came in and restored the temple. And then gradually, the whole area became, again, a Jewish place, and the nation of Israel was again back in their land and running things. The Romans came in and occupied, but they didn't run the Jews out of there. So that at the time of Jesus, you have both Jew and Gentile occupying the promised land. Right? The Jews keeping all the law and all of the promises of God and keeping the traditions and so forth and so on going at that time. And the Romans who were there as an occupying Gentile force. And so they're both in the region come the time of Jesus. Right? So God, he's fulfilling his promise to regather them again back into the land of promise. Now Jesus comes. And the Jews don't recognize him as their Messiah. And in fact, in fulfilling prophecy, they actually reject their own Messiah. Right? And it ends up being that Jesus gets crucified. And because they rejected and didn't recognize their Messiah, not when he was there or immediately after. Because they even had time after where they could have repented. But they actually doubled down and said, even the people who follow Jesus, we're going to go and kill them too. And they just were carrying on. And then finally, in AD 70, God said enough, right? And the Romans came in under the authority of God because they were fulfilling a prophecy written in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, where he said the prince of the people who to come would destroy the sanctuary and the temple. Boom. They get dispersed again into the earth, and they're scattered all over, right? So we actually see, though, that this is called the diaspora, right? Where God scatters the nation of Israel in response to their rebellion and idolatry and disobedience to the promise. But each time when God disperses them, he also makes the promise that I will restore or return you back to that land, because he's still determined to keep the promise he made to Abraham. So even though he goes for some period of time where the Jews are just sprinkled among the nations and they have no homeland and they're being persecuted left and right. And I think that it's an amazing testament to the fact that the Jews have the true and living God, and they were able to keep their identity, keep the promises of God, keep the festivals of God, keep the tradition and the commandments of God, frankly. Throughout all that time, even though they had no nation, they had no homeland, they had no name, and they're persecuted from every side, unfortunately by like the Catholic Church and others who are trying to crush and completely waste them off of the earth, and they still were able to stand and to not thrive because they weren't in their own land, but they were able to stand and remain a people with a unique identity, faithfully looking to God as the one and only true God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, right? And so finally, you fast forward a little while, and first of all, God makes a prophecy, first in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 34. There's probably hundreds, if not maybe even thousands of Bible passages that predict the return of Israel back into the land that they called Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't called that before. That was the name the British gave to that region of of ancient Israel, modern day Palestine. And it was populated by both a remnant of Jews who were still in the region but had no nation, as well as Arabs and the children of Ishmael and the children of Esau, who were children of Abraham through the human effort of Abraham and Sarah, right? Not through the promise that came through Isaac, who ultimately became Israel. But they were all in the land until finally in 1948, because they really were supposed to go in there and retake the land. I think God would have blessed them to do that. And there was a call for what's called Aliyah. Aliyah basically is the Hebrew word that means the return. A call for them to come back. But they resisted that call. And they decided, we don't want to leave our lands and our property and our wealth and so forth and so on, and the places that we've developed it in Russia and in Germany and places like that. And the next thing you know, World War II hits. And who is public enemy number one? The non-combatant, non-national identity Jewish people, right? They were the ones swept up in the midst of warfare between nations, and they were the ones targeted to be hated more than anyone, actually to be blamed for causing the whole war. That is just demonic, people. That is Satan. Satan trying to just completely wipe the Jews off the map, because if he does that, he knows that God will not be able to fulfill the myriad of prophecy, the myriad of promises that he made to so many in ancient times. To Abraham, Isaac made promises, Jacob he made promises, Judah he made promises, David he made promises, Solomon he made promises, and on and on and on and on and on it goes. He promised. And Jesus himself, he promised. Right? So, God has not forgotten his people. And so if we read in Hosea chapter 3, verse 4 and 5, it says, "For the Israelites will live many days." I'm talking about the return here. That was where he said he would cast them out. Israel, I might as well read it. Hosea 3, 4 and 5. "For the Israelites will live many days without a king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or idol. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days." Right? Unfortunately, he used that whole time of World War II and the persecution they went under. And when that was all over, they basically look, they're going to kill us if we are here. Or they kill us if we go home. We should just go home. And God was using that as impetus to sort of encourage them to head back home. It's time now. It's time now. And when you go there and you say, hey, we are the nation of Israel and this is our land, and they made that declaration, the hosts of heaven themselves came to establish it and make it so. Because they went in there from the shores of the Mediterranean with enemies everywhere, outnumbered 10, 20 to 1, with effectively sticks and stones. They didn't have a whole bunch of guns and the weaponry that they have today, right? But they fought, and God fought for them, just like he did in the days of old, just miraculous stuff. They would come and windstorms would kick up, and they would throw rocks and they would hit the target right in the forehead like David and Goliath, right? And they held their unity, and without much natural force at all, they were able to push back all of those who were trying to drive them in the sea before they could even get going. How does that happen? And it wasn't just then, but it was war after war after war after war for about 40 years. Right? In 1967, they were able to take Jerusalem, right? Because God told them, go, they're getting ready to attack you again. Go down to Egypt before they can take off and just destroy all their planes while they're on the ground. And then Jordan and Syria decided, oh my goodness, they're hitting Egypt. Let's attack. After being told, don't attack us and we won't attack you. They attack Israel. Israel turns tail, runs them off on a rail, and then takes Jerusalem. And then in 1973, they actually got the sneak attack. They figured out, hey, let's attack them on Yom Kippur, their high holy day, the Day of Atonement. They'll be fasting. Every shop will be closed. Every Israeli will have set his guns down. They are worshiping on this day. This is their most holy day of the year. That's when we'll get them. And sure enough, it works for a minute. A sneak attack. They come from the south and from the north, and Egypt comes rolling in. And all of a sudden, Golda Meir, who was prime minister at the time, sends a message over there to Richard Nixon and says, help. And the Americans come swooping in like an eagle, and basically we give them arms and give them some help. That took some time to ramp up. They're getting ready to just get completely obliterated. And so they finally gather themselves together, and all of a sudden a windstorm shows up, and the dust comes up in the Sinai Peninsula and stops the tanks and so forth of Egypt in their tracks. They can't even move for 2 or 3 days. Or a day or 2 days or whatever it was. They couldn't even move because they couldn't see. And that gave Israel this critical time so they could arm themselves and get themselves together and rally their defenses without even knowing where should we go. We're being attacked on 3 sides with the sea behind us. Who should we go after? And so wisdom came over them. Go and defeat. I'm handing the Egyptians to you. And they began to fly very, very low through the Sinai Peninsula beneath the fire of the Egyptians and started taking out tanks with their planes. Right? When they were going higher, they were actually ready for them and they were shooting down Israeli planes. But when they decided to change their tactic and to go very low, which is kind of risky, but they came in low and they were able to start taking out tanks, and they drove the Egyptians back. Then turned around and then started heading and pushing the Syrians back, and then heading east, pushed the Jordanians back, and actually ended up with more land than they started with. In spite of such as God is fighting for them. Make no mistake. He is fighting for Israel just like he did in the days of old. It's because it's not them who's giving them that land or giving them that success, but it is a response to the prophetic utterance of God himself. He says in Ezekiel 20:34, I will bring you from the nations and gather you from the countries where you have been scattered, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with outpoured wrath. It's not enough. How about Isaiah 11? There's a bunch of verses that talk about this. Isaiah 11 and 11 through 12 in the NIV, it says, in that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that is left of his people from Assyria, from the lower parts of Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, which is Africa, from Elam, from Babylonia, which is north, right, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people from Judah, scattered people of Judah, from the 4 quarters of the earth. That is everywhere where they are. Aliyah. He's going to bring them all back into the earth, right? And if you look also, there's the whole prophecy in Ezekiel. Let me see if I can find that real quick. In Ezekiel, the 37th chapter, this is the prophecy of the dry bones, which I thought was very significant because the dry bones, there's several interpretations of these dry bones, and I think probably all of them are accurate. Right? One person I was listening to earlier today was talking about the dry bones representing the bones of Joseph, who was buried in Shechem in Israel. And there's a whole teaching around that I thought was very interesting and could very well be a prophetic fulfillment for the dry bones talked about in Ezekiel 37. But I thought it very interesting that if you think about the imagery, and we've all seen this imagery of World War II, of the Holocaust, where you saw heaps and heaps of dead bodies and bones. It's the saddest sight you've ever seen. You know, it just turns my stomach whenever I look. And I was going to print that, but I didn't even want to show that on my videotape because it's just really pitiful what happened to the Jews and how they were persecuted during World War II. And I have friends whose families are in those heaps. And it breaks my heart to know that they have loved ones, whole generations of their history just wiped out. Wiped out. It's crazy. It is crazy. And even Benjamin Netanyahu referenced this when his recent visit to Germany, right? Referenced the passage in Ezekiel 37 as being fulfilled with the restoration of Israel, right? And that the bones were actually talking about those heaps of dry bones that resulted from World War II as something that God would then breathe life back into and establish those bones as a new nation, right? And I'm going to just read some of Ezekiel 37. It says, "In the hand of the hand of the Lord came upon me and brought me out in the spirit of the Lord," Ezekiel says in verse 37, verse 1, or chapter 37, verse 1, "and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. Then he caused me to pass by them all around. Behold, there were very many in the open valley." Very many suggested to me that it wasn't just the bones of Joseph, right? That's why I thought that interpretation was a little weak. Very many. It's like stacks and stacks and stacks. It really seems like it looked more like, to me, an image of what we saw in World War II, at the end of World War II. And indeed, they were very dry, already dead, right? "And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live?" So I answered, "Oh, Lord, you know." "I don't know. Tell me, God." Again, he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, surely I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. I will put sinews on you and bring flesh upon you. Cover you with skin and put breath in you, and you shall live. Then you shall know that I am the Lord." In other words, they tried to kill you and stuff you out and make you cease to be my people and to cease to be a nation with any sort of national identity or relationship to the God who called you. "But I will come and put life back into you, and I will establish you, said the Lord." No matter what the world does to you, they can't kill you, because I am for you. And I will establish you and fulfill all the promise that I made to Abraham. That's what God is saying to them. "So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and suddenly a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to bone. Indeed, as I looked, the sinews and flesh came upon them." So he's seeing a vision of this thing happening, but it represents something, right? "And the skin covered over them, but there was no breath in them. As also he said to me, Prophesy to the breath." And the breath is another word for spirit. Spirit. "Prophesy, son of man, and say to the breath, Thus saith the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, spirit, and breathe on these slain that they may live." The Spirit of God. It was similar to, you saw the image when God put Adam together. He formed Adam up out of the dust of the ground. And then it says he breathed into him the breath of life. And at that point, Adam became a living soul. Here, God's having the same imagery with the nation of Israel. That first, he picked up the dead bones and that which had been destroyed and discarded, and that the earth rejected, and tried to make it like it was just pure rubbish. And he said, "No, it's not rubbish. These are my people." And he put them back together and made them stand on their feet and put flesh over them. And then the only thing that they needed before they could have life again was the Spirit of the living God. So he spoke to the Spirit of God and said, "Call from the four winds my breath. And now breathe into them, and they shall live." Right? And so I prophesied as he commanded, and breath came into them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. Don't we see that today? Nobody runs on Israel anymore. They got nukes. I mean, they are a great army, not necessarily in number, but they're great in their ability. And nobody in the Middle East even contemplates trying to mess with Israel anymore, because God has blessed them and has fulfilled this prophecy in Ezekiel 37, verse 10. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel." Now I just see, remember what we said about interpreting Bible prophecy? If you just keep reading, it will tell you what it means. We don't need to guess. We don't need to interpret. We don't need to say anything. It says, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel." They're not a single man in Israel, right? They indeed say, "Our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and we ourselves are cut off," right? "Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up from your graves and bring you into the land of Israel." So right after those bones were killed in World War II, 3 years later in 1948, God fulfills his promise, and he brought them back to the land of Israel. He brought them back, right? We see the prophecy being fulfilled. That was probably one of the greatest prophetic fulfillments of recent times. the reestablishing of the nation of Israel back in her ancient Holy Land. And only slightly more significant was their reclamation of the nation of the city of Jerusalem in 1967 and annexing it. And of course, the world is trying to get them to give up Jerusalem. You can forget it. It ain't happening on numbers of scores. Number one, the Jews will never give it up, right? But number two, God has a plan for that city. And there's so much prophecy lined up specifically around the city of Jerusalem for these times in which we live. But it first needed Israel to be a nation. And that was fulfilled in 1948, fulfilling this prophecy and the others that I've already mentioned, right? So God scattered them, but God also called them back and has reestablished them in the land. So this is why I'm like, people, we couldn't have possibly begun to see the fulfillment of Bible prophecy and say these are the last days if we did not have Israel in its own land, owning and occupying the city of Jerusalem. It was simply impossible. The prophecy must be fulfilled, right? And so tomorrow I'm going to go into actually some more of this, and I'm going to be focused in on even more prophecy surrounding the nation of Israel. And it becomes very crystal clear that when you compare both of these tracks, how God is dealing with the nation of Israel, as well as how God is dealing with the church in these last days, that they're both converging very rapidly on one thing, which is the return of Jesus Christ to the earth for his church, and the return of Jesus Christ to the earth to save all Israel, just like he said he would do in Romans chapter 11. That's all I have today, you guys. Thank you for joining me. God bless you, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Bye-bye.